The morning sun had barely risen over London when Captain James Morrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform one last time. The red tunic felt heavy on his shoulders, a weight he had carried with pride for 12 years. Today was supposed to be different. Today he was flying home to attend his daughter's graduation, something he had missed too many times before. James had served in the Royal Guard at Buckingham Palace, standing watch over the Queen's residence with unwavering dedication. His wife Sarah had called him 3 days ago, her voice trembling with emotion. Their daughter Emma was graduating top of her class from medical school. She had specifically asked if her father could be there. For once, James had managed to secure leave. His commanding officer had approved it personally, understanding that family moments like these were rare in their line of duty. The airport was busier than usual. Heathrow Terminal 5 buzzed with the energy of thousands of travelers rushing to catch their flights. James walked through the crowds in his full ceremonial uniform. He hadn't had time to change after his morning shift. The plan was simple: finish his duty at 6 in the morning, head straight to the airport, and catch the 8:30 flight to Edinburgh. Everything was timed perfectly. People stared as he passed. Some smiled, others nodded respectfully. Children pointed at the tall bearskin hat he carried under his arm. An elderly woman even stopped to thank him for his service. James smiled politely, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept checking his watch. Boarding would begin in 40 minutes. He had plenty of time. The security line moved slowly. James stood patiently, his military training keeping him calm despite the growing queue behind him. He placed his belongings in the gray plastic bins, his phone, wallet, keys, and the ceremonial sword that was part of his uniform. The sword was properly secured in its sheath, completely blunt for ceremonial purposes only. He had traveled with it before without any issues. When James stepped through the metal detector, it beeped loudly. A security officer, a young man named Derek Thompson, immediately became alert. Derek was relatively new to the job, having worked at Heathrow for only 8 months. He took his responsibilities seriously, perhaps too seriously according to some of his colleagues. Derek looked at James with suspicion. The uniform meant nothing to him. He had been trained to treat everyone equally, to never make assumptions based on appearance. In his mind, that was exactly what he was doing, his job. James explained calmly that he was a member of the Royal Guard traveling to Scotland for family reasons. He showed his military identification, his travel orders, and even a letter from his commanding officer. Everything was legitimate and properly documented. Other security staff glanced over, recognizing the uniform immediately. Some looked uncomfortable with how Derek was handling the situation. Derek wasn't satisfied. He insisted on conducting a full secondary screening. James tried to remain patient, explaining again that he had a flight to catch. The clock on the wall showed 7:45. Boarding would start in 15 minutes. Derek asked James to step aside into a separate screening area. Other passengers in line began to whisper and take out their phones. The secondary screening area was a small room off to the side. James was asked to remove his uniform jacket. He complied, though frustration was beginning to show on his face. Derek called for his supervisor, a woman named Patricia Chen who had worked at the airport for 15 years. Patricia arrived quickly, took one look at James and his documentation, and immediately understood the situation. She tried to intervene, explaining to Derek that members of the Royal Guard often traveled in uniform, and that his identification was clearly legitimate. Derek, however, felt challenged. In his view, Patricia was undermining his authority. He argued that rules were rules, that the ceremonial sword needed additional inspection, and that the uniform could be concealing something. James checked his watch again. 7:55. His heart began to race. Emma's face flashed in his mind. He had promised her. After missing her school plays, her birthday parties, and countless other moments, he had finally promised to be there for the most important day of her life. Outside the screening room, a crowd had gathered. Several passengers had recorded the initial interaction and were now posting videos online. A businessman named Robert Hayes, who had been standing behind James in line, was particularly vocal. He couldn't understand why a decorated military officer was being treated like a criminal. Robert started a video on his phone, narrating what he was witnessing. Patricia made a decision. She told Derek clearly that James was cleared to proceed to his gate. His documentation was in order, his sword was a ceremonial piece, and there was no legitimate reason to detain him further. Derek reluctantly agreed but insisted on having James fill out additional paperwork, a requirement that Patricia knew was unnecessary, but didn't want to argue about in front of a passenger. By the time James finished the paperwork, it was 8:10. He grabbed his belongings and ran toward his gate. His heavy boots echoed through the terminal. People moved aside as the uniformed guardsman sprinted past. His hat nearly fell from under his arm. His heart pounded not from exertion but from panic. He reached gate 47 at 8:23. The gate was closed. A tired-looking gate agent shook her head apologetically. The aircraft door had been sealed at 8:20, as per standard procedure. James stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the closed door that separated him from his promise to his daughter. He tried to explain. He begged. He showed the agent his letter, his reason for traveling. She was sympathetic but firm. Airline policy was clear. The plane was preparing for pushback. There was nothing she could do. James slumped into a nearby seat, still in his full ceremonial uniform. The very uniform that represented honor, duty, and service had somehow become the reason he would miss another important moment with his daughter. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He had to call Sarah. He had to tell Emma that once again he wouldn't be there. Meanwhile, the videos from the security checkpoint were spreading rapidly across social media. Robert Hayes had posted his footage with the caption, "Royal Guard humiliated at Heathrow. This is how we treat the people who protect us." Within an hour, it had been shared thousands of times. People were outraged, demanding answers, calling for accountability, but James knew nothing about any of that. He sat alone at the empty gate, a decorated soldier who had just lost a battle he never expected to fight. The battle between duty and family, between protocol and common sense, between following orders and doing what was right. Sarah Morrison was setting up the graduation ceremony venue when her phone rang. She saw James's name on the screen and smiled, expecting to hear that he had landed safely in Edinburgh. Instead, she heard the defeat in his voice before he even spoke. That particular silence told her everything. James explained what had happened at the security checkpoint. His words came out in fragments, broken by pauses where he struggled to maintain composure. Sarah listened without interrupting, her own heart sinking with each detail. She had seen this pattern before. The missed birthdays, the empty chair at Christmas dinner, the promises that circumstances always seem to break. Emma was at the university, preparing with her classmates. She had checked her phone multiple times that morning, waiting for a message from her father saying he had landed. She had even saved a seat for him in the family section, right in the front row where he could see her receive her diploma. Her friends knew how much this meant to her. They had heard countless stories about her father, the royal guard who stood watch over the palace, the man who served his country with absolute dedication. Back at Heathrow, the situation was escalating in ways James couldn't have imagined. Robert Hayes's video had gone viral. News outlets were picking up the story. Television reporters were making their way to the airport. Social media was exploding with opinions, debates, and demands for action. A journalist named Michelle Peters saw the video while scrolling through her morning news feed. She worked for a major newspaper and had covered military affairs for years. Something about the story didn't sit right with her. She made some calls, reached out to contacts at the Ministry of Defense, and started digging deeper. At the airport security office, Patricia Chen was in an emergency meeting with senior management. The videos had been brought to their attention by the communications department. Airport officials were scrambling to understand what had happened and how to respond. Derek Thompson sat nervously in the corner, realizing that his actions had created a public relations crisis. The airport's director, Martin Blackwell, reviewed the security footage from multiple angles. He watched Derek's interaction with James, saw the unnecessary delays, and noticed Patricia's attempts to intervene. Martin had served in the military himself years ago. He understood both the security concerns and the respect that should be afforded to serving members of the armed forces. Meanwhile, James had managed to book a seat on a later flight, but it wouldn't depart until 2 in the afternoon. He would miss the graduation ceremony entirely. It started at noon. Even if the plane sprouted wings and flew faster than physics allowed, he couldn't make it. He called Sarah back and asked her to apologize to Emma. Sarah's voice was tight when she replied that she would tell their daughter, but they both knew an apology wouldn't heal this wound. Emma received her mother's text message during a break in rehearsal. She read it 3 times, hoping the words would somehow change. Her classmate Jennifer noticed the tears forming in Emma's eyes and put an arm around her shoulder. Emma tried to smile, tried to pretend it didn't matter, but everyone could see it did. The story was now trending nationally. People who had never met James Morrison were expressing outrage on his behalf. Veterans groups were issuing statements. Members of Parliament were being asked for comments. The narrative had become bigger than one man missing one flight. It had become a symbol of bureaucracy overriding common sense, of security theater trumping human dignity. A retired Royal Guard named Colonel Richard Pemberton saw the news coverage and immediately recognized James from his uniform number. Richard had been James's mentor when he first joined the Guards. He picked up his phone and called the Ministry of Defense directly. Richard still had connections, people who owed him favors, people who could make things happen. At his office in Westminster, Defense Minister Thomas Bradley was blindsided by the growing controversy during his morning briefing. His communications director showed him the videos, the social media reactions, and the news coverage. Thomas understood immediately that this situation required careful handling. The optics were terrible. A decorated guardsman prevented from attending his daughter's graduation by overzealous airport security. Thomas made a decision. He instructed his staff to reach out to James Morrison directly. He wanted to speak with him personally, to understand exactly what had happened and to see what could be done. His assistant began making calls to track down James's contact information. Back at the airport, James sat in a quiet corner of the departure lounge, still in his uniform. People recognized him now from the viral videos. Some approached to express support. An older veteran shook his hand and shared his own story of military service conflicting with family obligations. A mother traveling with her children bought him a coffee. James accepted their kindness with grace, but inside he felt numb. Patricia Chen found James in the lounge. She approached hesitantly, unsure of her reception. She apologized profusely for what had happened, explaining that Derek was new and had misunderstood his authority. James listened politely but pointed out that Derek wasn't entirely to blame. The system itself was flawed. Regulations were applied without context or common sense. Michelle Peters, the journalist, arrived at Heathrow with a camera crew. She had done her research. She knew James's service record, 12 years in the Royal Guard, 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the ceremonial unit, commendations for bravery, a spotless record. She knew about Emma, about the graduation, about the years of sacrifice. This wasn't just a story about airport security. It was a story about the cost of service, about what military families gave up, about promises that circumstances made impossible to keep. Michelle requested an interview with James. Initially, he declined. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to get on a plane and try to salvage something from this disaster. But Michelle was persistent. She explained that his story needed to be told properly, that the public deserved to understand not just what happened, but why it mattered. James finally agreed. They found a quiet corner away from the crowds. Michelle asked simple questions and James answered honestly. He talked about his daughter, about the sacrifices military families make, about feeling like he had failed as a father even while succeeding as a soldier. His voice cracked when he mentioned Emma's saved seat in the front row, the seat that would remain empty. The interview was powerful in its simplicity. James wasn't angry or demanding justice. He was just a father who wanted to keep a promise to his child. When Michelle asked what he wanted people to take away from this situation, James paused for a long moment before answering. He said he hoped that people would remember that behind every uniform was a human being with a family, with obligations, with moments that mattered just as much as any ceremonial duty. The interview aired within hours. It added fuel to an already raging fire of public opinion. People weren't just angry anymore. They were moved. They saw themselves in James, saw their own struggles with work-life balance, their own missed moments, their own regrets. Emma Morrison walked across the stage at exactly 12:15 in the afternoon. The auditorium was filled with proud families, flashing cameras, and the buzz of celebration. Her mother, Sarah, sat in the front row, recording every moment on her phone. Next to Sarah was an empty seat with James's name card still placed carefully on it. Emma's name was called loudly over the speaker system. She climbed the steps in her graduation gown, her movement steady despite the emotions churning inside. The dean shook her hand and presented her diploma. Emma had graduated top of her medical class, an achievement years in the making. She smiled for the cameras, held up her diploma, and scanned the audience. Her eyes found her mother, found the empty seat, and something inside her cracked just a little. Sarah captured it all on video, tears streaming down her face. These were complicated tears, pride for her daughter's achievement mixed with sadness for her husband's absence, anger at the situation mixed with understanding of circumstances beyond anyone's control. After the ceremony, other parents congratulated Emma warmly. They had heard what happened. The story was everywhere now. Their sympathy was genuine, but it didn't fill the empty space. James's flight finally took off at 2:30. He sat by the window, still in his ceremonial uniform, watching London disappear beneath the clouds. Other passengers gave him space, sensing his need for solitude. A flight attendant who had seen the news coverage approached quietly and upgraded him to first class without asking. Small kindnesses from strangers, but they couldn't undo what had already been lost. At the Ministry of Defense, Thomas Bradley was dealing with growing pressure. Members of Parliament were demanding investigations. Veterans organizations were calling for reforms. The media circus was intensifying by the hour. Thomas's phone rang constantly with calls from various officials, each with their own perspective on the situation. Thomas finally connected with James during a brief moment when the plane's Wi-Fi allowed phone calls. The defense minister apologized personally for what had happened. He explained that he was looking into the situation and promised that changes would be implemented to prevent similar incidents. James thanked him politely, but his mind was elsewhere. No apology, no matter how well-intentioned, could give him back that moment with his daughter. The airport was now under intense scrutiny. Martin Blackwell, the airport director, held an emergency press conference. Cameras flashed as he stepped up to the microphone. He read a prepared statement apologizing for the incident, explaining that security protocols were being reviewed, and promising that staff would receive additional training on how to handle special circumstances. Reporters shouted questions. Why was a royal guard treated like a security threat? Why didn't supervisors intervene sooner? What specific changes would be implemented? Martin answered as best he could, walking a careful line between taking responsibility and defending his staff's intentions. Derek Thompson's name was mentioned multiple times. Martin refused to discuss individual employees but confirmed that the matter was being handled internally. Derek himself was sitting in a small office, suspended pending investigation. He watched the press conference on a computer screen, seeing his career potentially crumbling because of decisions he had made in good faith. His supervisor during the incident had told him to be thorough, to never make assumptions. He had done exactly that. Now he was being portrayed as the villain in a national news story. Patricia Chen felt torn. She had tried to intervene, had tried to explain to Derek that his approach was wrong, but she hadn't pushed hard enough. Should she have overruled him immediately? Should she have escalated the situation faster? These questions haunted her as she gave her statement to the investigation team. Social media continued to explode with reactions. The hashtag Justice for James was trending. People shared their own stories of security overreach, of missing important moments, of systems that valued procedure over people. Some defended Derek and airport security, arguing that rules existed for good reasons and couldn't be bent for everyone who claimed to have a good excuse. James landed in Edinburgh at 3:45. He rented a car and drove straight to the university. The campus was nearly empty now. The ceremony had ended hours ago. He stood in the parking lot looking at the building where it had all happened, feeling the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He drove to Sarah's sister's house where they were staying. Emma's aunt had hosted a small celebration after the graduation. When James walked through the door, still in his full uniform, the room fell silent. Emma was sitting on the couch, still in her graduation gown, her diploma resting on the coffee table. Father and daughter looked at each other across the room. James opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, but Emma stood up and walked toward him. For a moment, he wasn't sure what she would do. Then she hugged him tightly, her face pressed against the red fabric of his ceremonial tunic. They stood like that for a long time, neither speaking. Sarah watched from the doorway, fresh tears in her eyes. Emma's aunt quietly ushered other family members out of the room, giving them space. When Emma finally pulled back, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. She told her father that she understood. She had always understood. The uniform he wore represented something bigger than both of them. She was proud of his service, proud of his dedication, proud of the man he was. But she also told him with painful honesty that understanding didn't make the absence hurt any less. She had wanted him there. She had needed him there, and he wasn't. James listened, letting her words hit him fully. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame the security guard or the airline or anyone else. He took responsibility for a choice he had made years ago when he decided that serving his country was his calling. That choice had consequences, and this was one of them. Emma showed him the video Sarah had recorded of her walking across the stage. They watched it together on her phone. James saw his daughter's eyes scanning the audience, saw the moment she registered the empty seat, saw her force a smile anyway. It was one of the hardest things he had ever watched. Later that evening, the family gathered for a quiet dinner. The earlier celebration had been subdued, waiting for James to arrive. Now, with everyone together, they tried to recapture some joy. Emma showed her diploma to her father, explaining her plans for residency, talking about her future in medicine. James listened intently, asking questions, genuinely interested despite his emotional exhaustion. But underneath the conversation, something had shifted. A promise had been broken. A moment had been lost, and everyone in that room knew that some things couldn't be recovered. The public outrage, the media attention, the official apologies. None of it changed the fundamental fact that James had missed his daughter's graduation. Outside that small dining room, the story continued to grow. News channels ran segments analyzing airport security procedures. Think pieces were written about military sacrifice. Politicians positioned themselves on various sides of the debate. But inside, a family was simply trying to find their way through disappointment to something that resembled forgiveness. The investigation into the airport incident moved quickly. Public pressure demanded answers and accountability. Within days, an independent review board was assembled, comprising representatives from the Civil Aviation Authority, airport security experts, and military liaisons. They reviewed hours of security footage, interviewed witnesses, and examined the procedures that had led to James Morrison missing his flight. Derek Thompson sat across from the review board in a sterile conference room. His hands trembled slightly as he answered their questions. He explained his thinking step by step: the metal detector alarm, the ceremonial sword that technically qualified as a weapon, his training that emphasized treating everyone equally regardless of uniform or status. He had been taught that assumptions were dangerous, that terrorists could wear any disguise. He genuinely believed he was doing his job correctly. The board members listened without expression. One of them, a retired military officer named General Susan Hartford, asked Derek if he had considered the context. A man in full Royal Guard uniform, with proper military identification, traveling to a family event. Derek replied that context could be manipulated, that his training emphasized following protocols consistently. General Hartford leaned forward. She explained something that Derek's training had apparently missed. There's a difference between being thorough and being inflexible. Security required judgment, not just rule following. The ability to assess genuine threats while allowing legitimate travelers to proceed was the mark of a skilled security professional, not a weakness. Patricia Chen testified next. She admitted that she had recognized the situation was being mishandled, but had been hesitant to undermine Derek's authority publicly. The board asked why she hadn't pulled rank immediately. Patricia explained the delicate balance of managing security staff. Overruling officers too quickly could damage their confidence and authority in future situations. In hindsight, she acknowledged, she had prioritized Derek's development over James's urgent need to catch his flight. The media coverage intensified rather than diminished. Michelle Peters, the journalist who had interviewed James, published a comprehensive article examining the broader issues his case represented. She interviewed dozens of military families who shared similar stories of missed moments, broken promises, and the invisible costs of service. One story particularly resonated with readers. A Royal Navy officer named Commander Lisa Andrews had missed her son's first birthday, because her ship's leave was cancelled due to operational requirements. When she finally returned home 3 months later, her son didn't recognize her. He cried when she tried to hold him. That had been 8 years ago, and Lisa said the memory still haunted her. Another veteran, Sergeant David Foster, described missing his father's funeral because his unit was deployed overseas. The military had offered emergency leave, but by the time the paperwork was processed and transport arranged, the funeral had already taken place. David said he understood the necessities of military operations, but understanding didn't ease the guilt or the grief. Michelle's article connected these individual stories to larger questions about how society supports its military families, whether the sacrifices demanded were reasonable, and how systems could be reformed to honor both national security needs and basic human moments. The article went viral, shared hundreds of thousands of times across social platforms. James spent 3 more days in Edinburgh with his family. He attended a small party that Emma's aunt organized, met some of her friends from medical school, and tried to be present even though part of him remained stuck at that airport gate. Emma was gracious and warm, but James could sense the disappointment she was working to overcome. On the last evening, Emma asked her father to take a walk with her. They wandered through a nearby park as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Emma talked about her future, her hopes of specializing in emergency medicine, her desire to help people in their most vulnerable moments. James listened, recognizing that his daughter had inherited his sense of duty, his desire to serve, just in a different uniform. Then Emma asked a question that James had been dreading. She wanted to know if it was worth it. All the sacrifices, all the missed moments, all the years of putting duty first. Was the service he provided worth the cost to their family? James didn't answer immediately. They walked in silence for several minutes. Finally, he told her the truth as he understood it. He didn't know. He believed in his service, believed in protecting his country, believed that someone had to stand guard. But he also recognized that every choice involved trade-offs, and the cost had been higher than he had anticipated when he first put on the uniform. Emma appreciated his honesty. She told him that she didn't regret his career, didn't wish he had been a different person. But she also needed him to understand that children didn't pause their growth waiting for parents to be available. Moments passed whether you were there to witness them or not. She would always love him, but she also needed to be honest about what his absence had cost them both. Back in London, the review board completed its preliminary findings. They concluded that while Derek Thompson had acted according to his training, the training itself was inadequate. Security protocols needed updating to include better guidance on handling military personnel in uniform, on exercising judgment alongside rule following, and on escalating unusual situations more quickly to experienced supervisors. The board recommended that Derek receive additional training rather than termination. He was young, learning, and had genuinely tried to do his job. However, they also recommended that Patricia Chen face consequences for not intervening more decisively. As the experienced supervisor on duty, she bore responsibility for allowing the situation to escalate unnecessarily. Martin Blackwell, the airport director, announced a series of reforms based on the review board's recommendations. All security staff would undergo enhanced training, focusing on contextual judgment. A rapid escalation protocol would be implemented for situations involving military personnel, emergency responders, and others with legitimate security credentials. Supervisors would be empowered and expected to intervene immediately when protocols were being applied inappropriately. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some praised the airport for taking responsibility and implementing meaningful changes. Others argued that the reforms didn't go far enough, that the entire approach to airport security needed fundamental rethinking. Civil liberties groups pointed out that this case received attention only because it involved a sympathetic figure, a decorated military officer missing his daughter's graduation. They asked what happened to ordinary travelers who faced similar treatment without the benefit of public sympathy or media coverage. Defense Minister Thomas Bradley met with James in person when he returned to London. The meeting took place at the ministry offices, a formal setting that felt appropriate for an informal conversation. Thomas reiterated his apology and outlined steps the military was taking to better support personnel traveling for family, Obligations. James appreciated the minister's time but pointed out that policies were only as good as their implementation. He had possessed all the proper documentation, all the official approvals, and still the system had failed. Paper policies meant nothing if the people enforcing them didn't use common sense alongside their training. Thomas couldn't argue with that assessment. He promised to work with airport authorities to create better coordination between military administration and civilian security. Special liaison officers would be designated to handle situations involving military personnel. A hotline would be established for rapid verification of credentials and circumstances. These were meaningful reforms, but James left the meeting wondering if they truly addressed the core issue. The problem wasn't just procedures or communication channels. The problem was a culture that had elevated security theater over human judgment, that valued rigid rule-following over thoughtful assessment of actual risk. 3 weeks after the incident, James returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace. The palace gates, the familiar routine of changing the guard, the weight of his uniform felt different somehow. His fellow guardsmen greeted him with quiet support. Everyone had seen the news coverage. Everyone knew what had happened. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Peters, James's commanding officer, called him into his office on the first day back. Andrew had served for 30 years and understood the unique pressures faced by ceremonial guards. Their duties required absolute precision and dedication, yet they were expected to maintain normal family lives when off duty. The two worlds often collided painfully. Andrew asked James how he was managing. Not a formal inquiry, but a genuine question between soldiers who understood sacrifice. James admitted he was struggling. The public attention had been overwhelming. Strangers recognized him on the street, offering sympathy or sharing their own stories. He appreciated their kindness but found it exhausting to constantly relive the incident. More difficult was his relationship with Emma. She had returned to her medical studies, thrown herself into her work with intensity that James recognized from his own approach to difficult emotions. They talked on the phone weekly, but conversations felt strained. Both were being careful with each other, neither willing to address the underlying tension that the missed graduation had created. Sarah was caught in the middle. She supported her husband's career and understood military demands. She was also a mother who had watched her daughter's disappointment, who had sat beside an empty seat that represented years of accumulated absences. Sarah found herself questioning choices they had made decades ago when James first joined the military. Meanwhile, the broader conversation sparked by James's case continued to evolve. Parliament convened a special committee to examine airport security procedures. Testimony was heard from security experts, civil liberties advocates, airline representatives, and affected travelers. The case of Captain James Morrison became a reference point, invoked repeatedly in discussions about balancing security with common sense. Derek Thompson watched these proceedings from his small apartment. He had been reassigned to non-public-facing duties pending completion of his additional training. The demotion stung, but more painful was his transformation into a public symbol of bureaucratic rigidity. Online commenters debated whether he was a scapegoat or genuinely at fault. Derek struggled with the question himself. His family encouraged him to move on, to see this as a learning experience rather than a defining failure. His father, a police officer, reminded him that everyone made mistakes in judgment, especially when learning complex jobs. But Derek couldn't shake the image of Captain Morrison sitting alone at that gate, defeated by a system Derek had enforced. Patricia Chen faced different consequences. Her reprimand was formal and would remain in her personnel file. More significantly, she was removed from her supervisory position and returned to standard screening duties. She accepted the demotion without complaint, recognizing that she bore responsibility for not acting decisively when her experience told her the situation was wrong. The case attracted international attention as well. Security experts from other countries studied what had happened at Heathrow, examining their own procedures to identify similar vulnerabilities. Some airports implemented changes proactively. Others defended their existing protocols as necessary in a dangerous world. A security consultant named Dr. Rachel Kim published an analysis that gained widespread attention. She argued that the incident revealed a fundamental flaw in how security personnel were trained. Rules were emphasized over judgment because rules were easier to teach and easier to enforce consistently. But true security required the ability to assess genuine threats while facilitating legitimate travel. Training officers to follow protocols without developing their judgment created exactly the kind of situation James had experienced. Dr. Kim proposed a radically different approach. Security training that emphasized decision-making skills, that used realistic scenarios to develop officers' ability to distinguish between actual risks and false positives. She acknowledged this training would be more expensive and time-consuming, but argued it would produce more effective security professionals. Her proposals sparked debate among security professionals. Some embraced her ideas as overdue reforms. Others worried that emphasizing judgment over rules would lead to inconsistent application of security measures, potentially creating vulnerabilities that terrorists could exploit. James found himself unexpectedly thrust into this debate. He was invited to speak at a conference on airport security. Initially, he declined. He wasn't an expert on security protocols, and he didn't want to be reduced to a symbol in an ongoing political argument. But the organizers persisted, explaining that his perspective as someone who had experienced the system's failures was precisely what the conversation needed. Eventually, James agreed. He prepared remarks that focused not on policy details, but on human costs. He spoke about the importance of security, acknowledging genuine threats and the difficult job security officers performed daily. But he also spoke about the need for systems to recognize context, to allow room for judgment, to remember that procedures existed to serve people, not the other way around. His speech was well received. Security professionals approached him afterward to share their own experiences of struggling with rigid protocols that didn't account for real-world complexity. Some admitted they had faced situations similar to Derek's, where training and instinct pulled in different directions. One retired security director told James something that stayed with him. She explained that after major security failures, systems typically responded by adding more rules, more restrictions, more protocols. This was understandable. People wanted to prevent future failures. But each layer of added security created new opportunities for exactly what had happened to James. Situations where legitimate travelers were caught in bureaucratic tangles. The challenge, she explained, wasn't choosing between security and flexibility. Both were necessary. The challenge was building systems that could maintain security while preserving space for human judgment. That required trusting and training security officers to make decisions, accepting that sometimes they would make mistakes, and creating accountability mechanisms that didn't simply punish every error. Emma called James after watching a video of his conference speech online. Her voice was different, less guarded than it had been in recent weeks. She told him she was proud of how he was handling the situation, turning personal disappointment into advocacy for systemic change. She also admitted that watching him speak had helped her understand his perspective better. They talked for over an hour, the longest conversation they had shared since the graduation. Emma described the pressures of her medical residency applications, the long hours of study, the weight of responsibility she felt for future patients' lives. James recognized parallels to military service, the dedication required, the personal sacrifices demanded, the tension between professional obligations and personal needs. Emma asked if her father had any regrets about his career choice. James answered carefully. He regretted specific moments he had missed. He regretted the pain his absences had caused his family. But he didn't regret the service itself, the commitment to something larger than himself. He had tried to live a life of purpose and meaning. That necessarily involved trade-offs. Emma understood that answer in a way she couldn't have before starting medical school. She was beginning to face similar choices. Relationships that would be strained by her schedule, personal interests that would take a back seat to professional demands, moments she would miss because duty called elsewhere. Understanding didn't erase the hurt, but it provided context. Sarah joined one of their phone calls, and for the first time since the incident, the three of them talked openly about the accumulated costs of James's career. Sarah expressed frustration she had held back for years. Emma shared memories of childhood disappointments. James listened without defending himself, allowing them space to voice feelings that needed to be heard. 6 months passed before the full impact of the Heathrow incident became clear. The reforms implemented at the airport were showing measurable results. Security processing times had actually improved despite the added emphasis on contextual judgment. Officers reported feeling more confident in their ability to handle unusual situations without unnecessary delays. Derek Thompson completed his additional training and was returned to public-facing duties. He approached his work differently now, carrying with him the hard-learned lesson that rules without wisdom could cause real harm. He would never forget Captain Morrison sitting at that closed gate, the embodiment of a moment that couldn't be recovered. One afternoon, Derek encountered a situation that tested his growth. A firefighter in uniform was rushing to catch a flight to his father's bedside after receiving news of a medical emergency. Derek saw the man's anxiety, checked his credentials quickly but thoroughly, and expedited him through security with appropriate speed. The firefighter made his flight. Derek felt a small measure of redemption. Patricia Chen had quietly worked her way back toward supervisory responsibilities. Her demotion had been painful but ultimately instructive. She now trained new security officers, emphasizing the lessons she had learned through failure. The importance of intervening when situations were being mishandled, the courage required to overrule someone even when they were technically following procedures, the recognition that good security protected people rather than simply enforcing rules. Michelle Peters continued covering the story of military families and the costs of service. Her reporting had evolved beyond James's case to examine systemic issues facing armed forces families. She documented the high divorce rates among military couples, the struggles children faced with frequent relocations and parental absences, the challenge veterans experienced reintegrating into civilian life after years of military structure. Her work contributed to policy discussions at the highest levels of government. New support programs were funded for military families. Bases expanded counseling services. The Ministry of Defense commissioned a comprehensive study of work-life balance challenges facing service members. These were incremental changes, but they represented acknowledgement that the human costs of military service deserved institutional attention. James found unexpected purpose in advocacy work. He was invited to join a committee examining military family support programs. His role wasn't ceremonial. He provided real input based on lived experience. The committee developed recommendations for more flexible leave policies, better family counseling services, and improved coordination between military requirements and family obligations. His own family remained a work in progress. Emma graduated from her residency application process with offers from several prestigious programs. She chose one close to London, explaining that proximity to family had become more important to her than program prestige. James understood this was both a gift and a statement. She wanted the possibility of him being present, but was no longer willing to rely on his promises. Sarah returned to work as a school administrator after years of prioritizing James's career moves over her own professional development. She was surprised to discover how much she had missed having her own professional identity. The work energized her, giving her purpose beyond managing the household logistics that military life demanded. The three of them navigated a new dynamic. James was more present when home, more intentional about the time they shared. He turned down some optional duties, set clearer boundaries between work and family. His commanding officer supported these changes, recognizing that retention of experienced soldiers required acknowledging their needs beyond the uniform. But everyone understood that some damage couldn't be fully repaired. Emma's graduation remained a missed moment, a permanent gap in the family's shared history. They learned to acknowledge this loss without letting it define their entire relationship. The empty seat in that auditorium became a reminder rather than a barrier. Robert Hayes, the businessman who had first filmed and posted the security checkpoint interaction, occasionally reflected on the incident's impact. His video had sparked a national conversation, led to policy changes, and altered several lives. He wondered sometimes about the butterfly effect of that single decision to press record on his phone. General Susan Hartford, who had served on the review board, used the Morrison case in training programs for military leaders. She taught officers to consider the second and third order effects of rigid policy enforcement, to recognize that maintaining troop morale and retention required acknowledging that soldiers were humans, with families and obligations beyond their military duties. The incident gradually faded from news cycles and social media trending topics. Public attention moved to other controversies, other stories, other symbols. But for those directly involved, the events of that morning at Heathrow Terminal 5 remained vivid and transformative. James was approached by a documentary filmmaker interested in exploring military family sacrifices. He initially declined, protective of his family's privacy after months of unwanted publicity. But Emma encouraged him to participate, arguing that their story could help other families feel less alone in their struggles. The documentary, when completed, presented James's case within the broader context of military service demands. It interviewed other families, included perspectives from military leadership and family support advocates, and examined both the necessity of military dedication and its human costs. The film was honest about trade-offs without offering easy answers. At the documentary's premiere, James sat between Sarah and Emma. Watching their story on screen was surreal and emotional. The film included footage from Emma's graduation, the empty seat clearly visible. But it also included recent footage of the family together, showing that they had found a way forward despite disappointment. After the screening, a young soldier approached James. He was stationed at a different palace but faced similar struggles balancing duty and family. His wife was expecting their first child, and he feared missing important moments. James talked with him honestly about the challenges, about the importance of setting boundaries where possible, about accepting that some sacrifices were necessary, while others were choices disguised as obligations. The conversation reminded James that his experience, painful as it had been, had value beyond his family. The public discourse sparked by one missed flight had created space for broader conversations about duty, sacrifice, and the systems that govern both. Policy changes implemented because of his case would benefit thousands of military families and millions of travelers. Emma started her residency in emergency medicine. The work was grueling, the hours punishing, the responsibility immense. She called her father during a particularly difficult shift, seeking advice on managing exhaustion and maintaining perspective. James recognized that their relationship had evolved into something different than traditional parent-child dynamics. They were colleagues in service now, each dedicated to missions that demanded sacrifice. On the anniversary of the missed graduation, the Morrison family held a private ceremony. They reviewed the video Sarah had recorded, watched Emma cross that stage, and collectively acknowledged both the loss and their resilience. James apologized again, not because he hadn't already, but because some apologies deserved repetition. Emma accepted, not because the hurt was gone, but because love persisted despite disappointment. They planted a tree in their garden that day, a symbol of growth and continuity. James, Sarah, and Emma each placed dirt around the roots, a small ritual marking their commitment to move forward together. The tree would grow slowly, patiently, much like the healing they had undertaken as a family. Years later, when people asked James about the airport incident, he would explain that it had been both the worst and somehow the most important day of his military career. Worst because he had failed his daughter when she needed him. Important because it had forced necessary conversations about duty, family, and the balance between them. Out of personal failure had come institutional growth, policy reform, and deeper family honesty. The empty seat at Emma's graduation would always represent loss, but it also represented catalyst, transformation, and ultimately a hard-won wisdom about what truly mattered. Some lessons James had learned could only be taught through pain. The question was whether you learned from that pain or let it define you. The Morrison family had chosen to learn.